All right, welcome back, Mules. This is Coach Loretta and Coach Reese here with Coffee with Coaches. We're excited to be here with you this week. This week's topic, we're going to talk about Kettle Moraine 100. So we got a couple weeks, about 6 weeks away now, 6 weeks and a couple days, I believe. So we're going to talk about 5 different things to give you an idea of what to expect for Kettle. We're going to talk about strategizing the course. We're going to talk about the elevation profile. We're going to talk about heat, and then what do we do now with 6 weeks away, and Kettle fast approaching? So this podcast is going to be to give you an idea of what to expect from Kettle Moraine 100. We're going to go through some considerations for the 50K and the 100K as well. But hopefully after walking away, you should have a pretty good idea just from listening to this, what you're in for if this is your first time running. And if it's not your first time running, if you're pretty seasoned, like this will be my third time running. I love talking about Kettle. It's just a great topic. So tune in, enjoy. This should be a good conversation filled with all things Kettle Moraine 100. So let's go. Number one, the course description and walkthrough. I kind of wanted to start with just introducing people to the course. So we're going to start in Nordic. And I think the big thing, Loretta, with this race is that first half Nordic loop is probably the most infamous section of the course. I want to say that's the one that most people tend to not enjoying because it is the hilliest part of the course. Have you heard anything, or have you run at that section of the course?
I have not. I've not been to Kettle. I've coached some athletes through it, but
Mhm.
yeah, no. I usually hear big complaints about the prairie and the final third of the race.
Yeah,
So
totally.
tell us about Nordic.
Those are the 3 sections for sure. So Nordic, to put it into perspective for anybody that's been to Potawatomi, very similar terrain where you're going to be going uphill, probably no more than 50 to 100 feet or so if there is a hill, but it's going to punch it pretty good. Usually instantly, you'll come back down the other side of that hill. So a lot of people tend to not like it that much. Because the first time going out, a lot of people end up taking those downhills too fast, right? We're excited for the race, we're tapered, we've been training, we want to go. The energy of the event starts, you want to rip through it. And a lot of people end up blowing out their quads that first section. So just beware that first Nordic loop before you get to Bluff is going to be probably the most elevation gain per mile of the course. Um,
And how many
so
miles is that?
from Nordic to Bluff, we're talking about 7 miles.
Okay.
So Bluff is the second aid station. So you're going to pass from the Nordic aid station to Tamarack and then to Bluff. So Tamarack is about 5 miles away. Um, so it's probably the most beautiful section, in my opinion, the most beautiful wooded section. You have tall pines. There's some portions that are grassy. There's some portions that are more pine needle beddy. It's fairly not exposed. So you'll have some tree coverage. There's a couple open spaces, but it's definitely not as notorious as the prairie. So Nordic section all the way up to Bluff and Confusion Corner, we're talking most of the elevation is going to be right there condensed. Or not most of the elevation, but most of the average elevation, right? It's going to be really hilly there. Little exposure. But yeah, those hills can be a killer. And especially when you come back on the 100K, those will definitely chew you up. So most people if you're doing the 100 mile, you're going to hit the Nordic section one, two, a total of 3 times.
Okay.
So if you're running the 100K, you're going to do it twice because you're going to do a big out and back, right? You start in the middle, you run north, you come back. And if you're doing the 50K, you're pretty much just going to hit it once. So lucky you. Um, but yeah, so coming out of Nordic, then we hit Bluff and we hit the Confusion Corner area. And Sid Wagner actually posted this really awesome video that I shouted out last year in our preview, just about how to navigate Confusion Corner, because that's where we first hit the Ice Age Trail. So all the 100-mile runners, all the 100K runners, your first time hitting Confusion Corner, you're going to end up taking a right to go north on the Ice Age Trail. Right next to it is, where you would end up going south. So we should actually probably link in the description that video because Sid gives a really awesome walkthrough of that corner. I would hate to see anybody get tripped up by that, but we all know as we get bonky, as we get tired, we're not always thinking with our rational hats on. So yeah, just something to to be aware about. Confusion corner is something that, like, if you're not prepared, can be a little bit like, huh, which way do I
Confusing.
go? Yeah, exactly. Right. But there's definitely resources out there to help you just kind of breeze right through it. And I think that, like, that's probably the quickest way that people, end up tacking on miles to their race, is just like forgetting where to go. It's a super easy course. Like, you're either going out or you're going back, but that's the one spot that you want to pay attention.
Okay.
Okay, so we hit Confusion Corner. We start turning north. We go to Natalie's, or we go towards like the horse riders aid station, Natalie's aid station. That section can typically be like fairly exposed. It's definitely grassy. It's a little bit more rolling. There's not quite as dense of forest. Probably like 2 to 3 miles after that Confusion Corner. And that's where we start to hear like gunshots from McMiller. So if you're not used to that and you start hearing gunshots, don't worry. It's nobody aiming at you. It's just one of the like top shooting ranges probably in like the Midwest in this area. So, but you end up passing through that aid station again. It's like pretty grassy. It's pretty rolly. There's not a crazy amount of elevation gain there. You're probably going to hit a couple hills, especially around or like going up towards horse riders. um, the entire first like half of that first out and back, like going all the way up to Scuppernong, is a net uphill. So like when you look at the elevation charts, like when you start at Nordic and you're going all the way up to the Scuppernong loop, you're going up and down these little hills that end up adding a little bit of elevation. So a mistake that I made last year is that those were my fastest sections of the race because it's the first part of the course, it's the first part of the race. When those I should have tempered a little bit more, because then when you're coming back, you're actually going net downhill. So you should be able to roll through that a little bit easier. But yeah, you end up getting to the Scuppernong loop. And I think that's like the next key area, because the Scuppernong loop is just like the Nordic loop. It has a lot of punchy climbs to it. That one is also fairly shaded too. Some beautiful like rows of pine trees are going to meet you in Scuppernong. So you do get a little break every once in a while with a good flat straightaway. So you come back through, you hit that loop, you do everything in reverse. You're coming back down like a net downhill, right? You come all the way back to Nordic. You hit the Nordic section again, the hilliest section, and you hit 100K. So you did your out and back, and that's going to take a while. Oh, you know what? Okay, so I forgot to mention the prairies. Prairies. Typically, now the prairies can be kind of debated as far as like where they actually are. Typically, in my mind, I'm thinking that's like after you hit McMiller towards like Highway 67, kind of that area, that Wilton area. You'll know the prairies once you start going through like nothing but these like, face high grasses, if not like a little bit taller. There's no trees in sight except for just like a couple pockets of trees. So you'll know when you hit that section, because when you're running through those tall grasses, it just holds the moisture. Like the wooded sections can typically be fairly dry, but when you're in that like lowland and you have those grasses all around you, if it is hot out, and chances are you're going to be going through there in the middle of the day, so it'll be warm. You get the heat from the sun cooking your head and your back. But then you're also kind of like sitting in this humid environment too. So I think that's where the prairies really get their 1-2 punch and their notorious icon, I guess. So yeah, that's around like McMiller, Milton, Highway 67. Those are the prairies. That's where everybody is really terrified of, to be in the middle of the day. And that's going to be around like miles, let's see here, about like mile 20 to let's say mile 20 to mile 40 or so. Um, so that'll be pretty tricky. But okay, so you come all the way back to Nordic. If you're running the 100 miler, you come all the way back to Nordic, you hit 100K by the time you see the start finish, where you left hours before at the start of the race, right? And that is the trickiest part of the 100 mile run, in my opinion, is because you hear it all the time. Like things are going great, and then you see your car and you're at the start finish line, and you know that you can just kind of drop there. And it's already been a really long day, but you still have basically a 20 mile out and back to do. 2 long runs. It's kind of, if you let it get to you, it can be a little demoralizing, because you're like back near all the crowds, the cowbells, everybody's cheering. You already had a really long day. It was a great effort, but you still have so much further to go. But good news, if you keep this in mind, if you keep in mind that if you just get out of that aid station before you have time to think that you can drop, you have what I think is the easiest part of the course left. That can be debated. Let me defend myself. The listeners, whoever's listening to this, might get pretty offended by that. The reason why I think it's the easiest is because it is the least hilly. However, it is a little bit more technical. So, especially as you get out towards Rice Lake, you have these undulating ups and downs. You have a couple stairs. That's going to be where you meet the stairs, is over by Rice Lake. But there's a lot looser terrain. Like you see a lot of river rock. And I mean, the cool thing is, maybe you can think about this out on the trail. All of that river rock was deposited by glaciers like millions of years ago. So, not millions, hundreds, tens of thousands of years ago. So all of those little pebbles that are trying to trip you up that you're hating, like they've been here a lot longer than you have. It's just interesting to think about. But anyways, so you hit Rice Lake. It's fairly hilly and rolly, but there's nowhere near as much like ascent or descent as there is in the first 100K of the race. So that entire second half, once you get back out of Nordic, you go through Tamarack, you hit Bluff. Now you're taking a left in Confusion Corner. You're going down to Rice Lake. That's going to be like the place where if you saved yourself the first 100K, that's where you can really kind of like feel good and start passing people, because guaranteed there's going to be a ton of people that go out way too hard. They get chewed up by Nordic. They get heated out by the prairies over by like Wilton. And now they come back. And if they do decide to go back out, like their legs and their morale are probably a little bit tucker, a little bit trashed. So if you saved yourself, if you executed your plan accordingly, if you were consistent on hydration, nutrition, cooling yourself off, you should have a pretty good time going out to Rice Lake and back. If you can just keep in mind that like freshness is all relative. So freshness at 100K is not like, oh, you just started your run. Freshness at 100K meaning like, like nothing is seriously injured. You haven't gone through any serious lows. Like you're not on the verge of bonking. You feel fueled. You're excited to be out there. Maybe you have like the 100K fatigue in your legs, but like, that's expected when running these really long distances. So if you can, start that second after 100K, like out and back, feeling like, hey, like I'm in pretty good shape right now. Guaranteed you're probably going to pass a lot of people. And especially as it gets dark too, like that's the area I feel like where if you're out there past dark, it's already been such a long day that it's flatter terrain, but it's dark. Everybody's got their headlamps on and everybody starts hiking more, like even in the flatter terrain. So I feel like that's a spot where, age groupers, people who are looking to just kind of like pick up in the back half of a race, people that enjoy passing people like later on in the race, that's where you can really build some morale and start passing people, because a lot of people are going to turn their headlamps on. They're going to get into hike mode because it's dark. But if you're feeling pretty good, you can take advantage of that rolling terrain, knowing that like, hey, most of the elevation is done. So you hit Rice Lake, you come all the way back up to Nordic, boom, you hit your 100-mile mark. Congratulations, you finished.
You made
So
it sound so easy.
yeah, sounds very easy, right? So that's kind of my description. Again, those key spots. The first Nordic loop is going to be, the most elevation like per mile in that area. The prairies over by Wilton, about like mile 20 to 40 or so, are going to be pretty treacherous, especially because most people are going to be crossing them in the middle of the afternoon. So you got to be heat prepared. Again, you hit Scuppernong. That's not as hilly as Nordic, but it's still a very hilly section. And then coming back through the Rice Lake section, that second out and back, it's not quite as hilly, but it could be a little bit more technical. So Loretta, you and I are always like bantering about like making sure that we're doing our strength training, like a little bit of coordination training, like making sure that we get out onto some technical trails. So that way we can be experienced with navigating our feet across rocks and loose terrain and whatnot. So hopefully you put all of that together and you have a fantastic 100-mile finish. So that was a lot. That was a lot of me talking.
That was. So I have a question. This is your third year. So that changes things a little bit mentally. Like, how are you thinking about this? Because you know the course obviously very well. You just presented that. And so there's nothing new, right? It's going to be that same course. How are you going into that mentally?
Mentally, that's a good question. So I'm kind of okay. So long story short, like had a successful Potawatomi, came out of that, recovered for a couple days, and then as I started to build back up into running, I started having a calf niggle. I want to say yesterday, if anybody's following me on Strava, that's the first like run that I've had. I posted like I didn't have any lower leg pain during that run, which is great. So I'm kind of taking it a little bit more tentatively these next 6 weeks. My plan has changed for my training going into Kettle, and still, I definitely had to, or I'm grappling with the idea of like what's better for my long term health. If things rebound really quickly and my running goes great and my volume builds back up, and I feel like it's safe for my body to tackle the 100-mile distance, then I'll give it a go. But I have already kind of given up a sense of ownership of having to be there this year, which I think is a healthy position to be in. I might drop down to different distances, because this one event isn't my end all be all. So I just want to put that out there. It's not a guarantee that I'm going to be running this year. It's not a guarantee that anybody's going to be running this year. So I think we have to keep that long term perspective into account. But let's say I do run it, my mentality going in is, like I said before, is going to be to take that first 100K a little bit slower than I did last year. When I look over my splits, my fastest section was the first like 40 miles of the 100-mile race. And that's where all the elevation is. And then my average pace declines from there. And it's seen, just in my recollection of coming, like when I hit Highway 12, I knew that like my gears were gone. I was just in all day sustaining type of mode. So my mentality going in is, okay, I know now, like I finally had a kettle that I feel like I've given a hard, solid effort at. Now my mentality is more thinking about where are those little spots along the course where I pushed a little bit too hard. So that way I can save more energy and spread it out more throughout the entire race instead of concentrating it at the beginning. Um, However, I'm known for taking out races really hard, which I like to do. So it's kind of this dichotomy of like, okay, let's go out hard so that we can have fun and we can put some distance between me and everybody else, but let's not go so hard that we blow up. I don't know if that quite answers your question pretty well,
Yeah.
but that's kind of like my whole mental theory going in for this year. So don't take the first 100K quite as hard, but still like give it a really solid effort and not try to bank too much time. So that way, like I said before, I can get to Rice Lake feeling like, okay, like I have that extra gear I can click into because the terrain's a little bit flatter.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say I love that you're thinking about like your body and making sure you're ready for this race instead of just pushing through. It's a conversation I have with a lot of athletes is because we want to be here for longevity, not for one race. Even if it happens to be our A race, sometimes we just have to, make changes and adapt. I've had to do that over the last year, and I did what was right for my body, and now I'm healed and feeling pretty good and coming back. So I think that's super smart. So, but I also think going into a race for a third time is a little bit different. Like that first time, it's kind of like opening presents on Christmas, right? It's all brand new and you don't know. And then that second year, you know what you're expecting. And then that third year, you really know what you're expecting. And now you have pressure on yourself to even do better, So if you're healthy and ready to go. So
Yeah, mm, I try not to acknowledge pressure all that much. So I feel like that's a good mentality strategy for a lot of people. I mean, we put like this stuff on ourselves. Like, of
right.
course,
More on
like it's
ourselves than anybody, right? It's not
yeah,
somebody else is pressuring you, it's yourself.
yeah, it's known that I love that race. I always want to do really well at that race. I tried for the record last year at the race. I really want to do the record this year at the race. But at the same time too, like, like these are fun things. Like you can let that pressure, just like our mental performance coach Adam Pop says, you can let that pressure be you can let it be stressful or you can let it be enthralling. You know what I mean? So I almost try not to think about it as pressure and try to think about it as this excitement. Like
Yeah.
I get to do this. And quite honestly, too, I mean, like this is kind of going more towards me and not towards the kettle. But for everybody that listened last week, we met my girlfriend Deanna. I was telling her the other day, I was like, I would trade all the races I have on the calendar right now for just being able to be healthy and be at Veteran Acres for our Saturday morning group runs because I've missed probably most of them this year. And that's what I really miss is the training and the lifestyle and the experience instead of waking up and going onto the bike for a couple hours. So at the end of the day, like if I have to give up this year or not give up, if I have to alter expectations this year on how I thought my year would go, like I don't care if I can get healthy and I can actually be with my people on the trails. Like that's the bigger pressure for me is like, let's just get healthy so that we can start like, practicing what we preach again and like getting out there and being with the community and all that good stuff. So just to reframe mental things for everybody out there, that's kind of my trick and strategy for taking the pressure off of one event.
Oh, nice, nice.
Um,
Okay,
but
back to Kettle.
yeah, back to Kettle. So I think Kettle's really great. Like that time of the year, for some reason, like I've never had like a bad weather year there. I mean, there's hotter years, there's cooler years, there's years where you get a little bit of drizzle, but it's never been for me or for like my recollection. I don't think we've ever had like torrential rains like all day at that race. So I think typically the conditions that way are fairly decent most of the time. But of course, that's always subject to change
Hope you
based
didn't
on
just jinx
Mother
us.
Nature. That's what yeah, for real. Um, so, I kind of want to talk now, like we've already got like into this, but so Loretta, we talked about like the course and we talked about like different challenges and different sections. Like, how would you, like, say you were going into this 100-mile race, like, how would you strategize this given the terrain, given the weather, given the daylight? Like, how would you go about that?
So, first of all, I would be working on way off, far from the race, working on that strength piece and making sure I was really strong going in, ready for the climbs with both, single and double legged work. I think it's super important to help with running economy and also just to be strong on those climbs, right? So that would be something I prioritize and I do with my athletes as well. Probably since a lot of the training happens in the winter and you might not be able to get on the trails, I would probably be doing some treadmill incline work so that I could be ready also for those up and down hills that you're talking about. And then I like to have my athletes work on some agility work too, so they're comfortable with moving from side to side on the trail and their muscles and tendons and ligaments, everything is strong, to move safely. And then getting time on trails, I think is super important just for race specificity. I always try to, when I'm working with an athlete that's going to a race, try to find a spot that's sort of specific to your race, the closest that you can. We can't mimic exactly if we're not near the race, but we can kind of, do the best we can. And I think that's important. For a race like Kettle that's coming up, I'd also want to be prepared for making sure I'm spending some time outside running, not just doing inside running, making sure I'm getting some heat acclimation because it does get hot there and it does get really humid. So you want to be prepared for that. And also testing out heat strategies, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but testing them out during runs, I think is important so that you're comfortable and prepared for that. And then because you're going to be spending some time of the course in the nighttime, I would also be making sure I was spending some time in the dark, either early morning or nighttime. So you're used to the trail. So you're comfortable. The whole thing changes when it's dark, right? The lighting and all of that stuff is a little bit different. So those are some of the things that I would be doing 6 weeks out. There's time for a few big more pushes before you start your taper. So, getting that in, and I would suggest getting it on a trail so that you're, again, practicing that race specificity as much as we can as we move into our taper.
Yeah, for sure. I think those are all like great things. And just to like build on that too, like when we're talking about like getting like specific towards the demands of the trail, like one thing I like to do as a coach is think like, okay, what is the overall elevation gain? And then
Mm.
how many miles are we running, right? So like Kettle, I know on the website it says around like 8,000 feet of elevation gain for the entire race. I clocked about 10. So like let's average about like 9, right? And it depends
Right.
on like your watch. It depends on other things. Accurately guesstimating or analyzing elevation profiles, there's always a certain level of error. So I'm going to go with the nice number of like 9,000 feet per mile, or excuse me, 9,000 feet total. So if we divide that by 100, we get about 90 foot of gain, of elevation gain per mile. So
Mhm.
now when you're going on your runs, and this is something we've talked about before, right? But just to reiterate, like when you go out on your runs and you go out for a 10-mile run, think about like, okay, where are my 10-mile loops where I can get like an average of 900 feet of elevation gain? So that's kind of easy to keep in the back of your head, like for like your easy days or for some of your other days, like maybe sometimes you do just like that easy around the block type of loop and you're not really worried about it. And then maybe other days you're like, oh yeah, like this 5-mile loop that I have can get me 450 feet of elevation gain. But then also too, like as a coach, that's just an average, right? And we already mentioned that like the serious elevation is concentrated in like little pockets with some rollers in between, right? So that's where I really like to tell people that, hey, like if you can get on course and you can experience what that's going to feel like or what that grade is, awesome. If you can't, that's fine. Some places where people can mimic, like the Nordic and the Scuppernong loops, are going to be like the Black Loop at Lapham Peak if you're out in the Wisconsin area. It's going to be areas like Veteran Acres if you're out in the Crystal Lake area. You can always do hill repeats. You can always look at the elevation profile on people's Stravas and just see like, hey, what's the average grade? And then of this hill, and then try those grades every once in a while on a treadmill in the gym just to see like, oh, okay, I'm not going to be able to run this. Let's practice a little bit of hiking, you know?
Yeah, that's one thing
Um,
I was going to say. I missed mentioning was that hiking piece. I think that it's
mhm.
important to be prepared to hike some of the hills so that you're not using too much effort early on in the race.
Yeah, and a lot of ultras is just very efficient hiking, an efficient use of like, channeling your uphill and your downhill legs. There's an efficient way to go from hiking and running when you're going up and down hills, and then there's an inefficient way. So I think I've mentioned on the podcast last year, like I learned at my kettle, my first kettle, that like, if I was hiking up the climbs, like at first I would start to wait until I had already crested the hill to start running again. And it just, oh man, like getting my legs turning over after I've been hiking and turning over while you're going downhill is, they just feel like garbage. So what I started doing in the middle of my first kettle was like the very last like 10 steps going up the hill, I would just slowly start to build into a canter. So that way, by the time I was going downhill, my legs were already kind of like the rust was already kind of like busted off. So you can practice your hiking and your running while you're out at Veteran Acres. The hardest part, though, right, is that when we start our 20-mile long run on a Saturday morning, you're starting that run and you're feeling good, and nobody wants to start hiking when they're feeling good, right? But if we can start hiking when it's an option instead of being left to hike when it's a necessity, then we can control our race a little bit better. We can divvy out like when we're going to give a little bit more energy or when we're going to back off.
Right.
So, I mean, when you're out on the trails, like on your Saturday long run, like, maybe you do that from the start. Maybe you run for 10 miles and the back 10 miles, you really incorporate your plan, but it's going to take a lot of patience, a lot of diligence, and a lot of intention is the word that I want. A lot of intentional running, not just going out for the miles or getting the legs turning over, but having that intention of like, okay, how am I going to race? So how do I need to practice? And that's the piece that a lot of runners should be doing, you know?
Right. Right. And I just want to point out real quick that um Reese is doing some hiking in this race, and he was the overall winner last year. I mean, I think people have to put that in perspective. Sometimes I feel like people think, oh, I have to hike because I'm slower, and that's not the case at all. It's because it's smarter, right? That's like part of the game.
Yeah. It's ultra running. Like that's the label. Like, but it's not just running, it's ultra trekking. Whatever can get you from point A to point B as fast as possible, that's what it's got to be. It doesn't matter if you have a blazing fast first 20 miles, if it's going to slam you to the ground and you're going to be crawling to the finish, right?
Right.
So like that's where, that's where the strategy really comes in, is knowing like how hard can I push, and then having that feeling of what that's like, because maybe you're pushing pretty hard but you're going pretty slow because it's a really steep incline and things like that. So like people always, like I get the question, especially from people that don't have never run like a trail race, like how do you know how fast to go? And it's like, well, it's not a fastness, it's an effort. It's a,
Right.
like I never want to feel like, like I'm bleeding through my eyeballs, or like I've got that metallic taste in my mouth, or my muscles are burning. Like I never really want to feel that during a 100-mile race. So my speed is dictated then based on the terrain and based on my effort on the terrain. And
Mhm.
that's first Nordic section. It's going to be some hiking.
Right.
Um,
So one of the other things
so
to add that I would think about training for myself or my athletes is really dialing in hydration. And
Yeah.
not too long ago, we had Shannon O'Grady on the podcast from Gnarly Nutrition, and we talked a little bit about this. And it's a great time because it's starting to heat up to get yourself a sweat test. Decide, you all you need to do is weigh yourself naked before you go for a run. Weigh yourself when you come back. Usually, about an hour run is great for that. If you don't take anything in, you can just subtract the difference, and you want to, try to get 80 to 90% of that to kind of mitigate that loss, more if needed. But then do it also when it's cooler in the evening or at night, because it's going to be a difference in how much sweat that you're losing. And so when you're moving slower on the trail later in the night time, you're going to be needing less hydration. So I think knowing that is a good idea, just to have as a rule of thumb going into the race, kind of where you are, to make sure you're okay with that, because I think it's super critical in this race. If it's going to get 80 degrees and 90% humidity, that we're really thinking about hydration and electrolytes, and making sure that we're keeping that balanced and keeping up on it throughout the day, and not getting yourself into trouble, especially when you hit the prairies and it's super hot. And then what, right? You want to make sure you're all good going in, and you know what your plan is.
Yeah, and that's absolutely crucial. And like, word to the listeners, like, go back through our archives and like scroll through. Like, if this is your first time to the podcast, welcome. But we've got plenty of other good resources that we've done over the past year, which it's crazy to think that we've been doing this for a year now. So go and learn about like fueling, go and learn about nutrition, look at our archives, because we've spent a lot of time talking about this. So that's just a rabbit hole that you can absolutely go down. So it's definitely worth mentioning. But of course, we don't have another hour to just talk about like the nutrition that we could have. But yeah, it goes to mention that like like we need to be like figuring out like our hotter weather running. So when we do get these like hot days outside, like maybe you try as hard as you can to get your run in that day, because having that experience is important, especially with a race in the first week of June. That's like long, that's far enough into summer to know that like we're gonna have some hotter days. We could have some colder days, but it doesn't always give us the most time to really dial in our hot weather strategy.
Right.
So I think that's the tricky thing about having a race like early part of June. If it's August or September, you've already been living in the heat for a while. You kind of have it dialed.
Absolutely.
So I think too, like, since we're talking about strategy, like we need to mention the gear drops. So what's the word I'm looking for? Drop bags.
Uh-huh.
So we can have a drop bag at Nordic, which is the start finish, McMiller, Highway 67, and Highway 12. So let me pull up the mile markers here. So Nordic is again like mile zero, about 100K. McMiller is going to be 19 and 44, and all this information is online too. Highway 12 is going to be miles 77.9 and 86. And then did I say Highway 67 or was it ZZ?
I can't remember.
Highway 67. So
Okay.
Highway 67 are miles. Let's see. I can't even read that. It's a long ways out there. 29.4 and then 34.5. So there's multiple places where there's going to be aid. There's multiple places where there's going to be gear drop. But depending on how fast you're going to be running, you need to know about where you're going to need your headlamp.
Right.
Preferably,
Yeah.
it's going to be like a couple hours before you actually need it, just to give you a little bit of buffer with when you actually pick it up. And maybe if you've been in the game for a while and you've collected a number of headlamps, maybe you spread them out a couple areas, maybe giving your A goal, your B goal, and your C goal, just in case you end up falling back a little bit. I think it's always wise to not only rely on one spot. My first Kettle, I put my headlamp at mile 12, and I get there, I forget to grab it, I move on, and I'm like, oh shoot, it might be dark before I get back to Highway 12. And then you're running with this extra level of anxiety, and that's not good for your heart rate. It's not good for your mentality. You're burning resources just worrying about something. So if you can put that headlamp like a little bit closer, or I guess a couple hours like before sunset, it just gives you like a little bit of that buffer time just in case you do fall off a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's something to take into consideration too. as
Yeah.
well as putting all those like fun snacks that you want to put in
Right,
your
right. I
drop
was gonna
bag.
say we have old podcasts that kind of talk about that too, that you can go back on and thinking about like what gear are you going to use, vest or handheld. So go back in our archives and find that. But because I think there's a choice there, when you're thinking about the headlamp too, if we're gonna have a vest, you might as well just toss in a headlamp. It's not gonna weigh that much. But if you're not, then you're gonna make sure you're strategic about placing it in your drop bags.
For sure. And this race too, since we're talking about gear, like I think footwear is pretty important. It is not the it's not the most rugged trail. Like the Ice Age trail in that section is a very well-worn trail. So you're going to be able to have good footing. Say you've never ran a trail race and you show up with road shoes, chances are you're not going to be slipping and sliding around a bunch. So I think something that like has a moderate amount of like lug on it just to give you a little bit of traction is a good idea. If the course gets wet, there's certain lowland areas that will be very muddy. So, my idea of a good shoe would be like an ATV type of shoe where it's like it's not super lugged out, it's not super heavy, but it's got a little bit of grip for you wherever you need it. For people that, typically change into multiple pairs of shoes, maybe that looks like you have a lighter, like higher stack, but like not as lugged shoe for if it's dry. And maybe you pack one that is like an all weather shoe in case it gets wet, but with this course, like, I don't think you need anything super aggressive, but I also think like you need a little bit of lug underneath you. There's no sense in, trying to go too light and too quick with this course and not have anything underneath. So yeah, based on what you've been training with, that's going to dictate what you should be racing with. Like,
Right.
so hopefully now that we're 6 weeks out, if you don't have your shoes that you plan on racing in, maybe you can go pick some of those up and give them a couple long runs to kind of break them in, feel where the wear patterns are going to be, and then get that dialed. So that's something that we can absolutely do 6 weeks away from a race.
And now's the time to like dial all of that in, right? You're trying your gear, trying your shoes. Hopefully you have your hydration and nutrition pretty much dialed in, but you can, keep tweaking that and getting it just right. But you have time right now, but not much more time. So start working on those if you haven't been.
For sure. And, like going off of that thread too, like what the heck do we do now, like 6 weeks away from the race? Like, of course, we're always proponents of working on our like strategy and mentality because that's stuff that doesn't take any physical energy. It's not going to beat up your legs, but, going through different sections and thinking about the course, thinking about how you're going to handle the course, thinking about things like, okay, I know there's going to be some low points. What are going to be my tools to bring myself out of the low points? Whether it's something you can consume, something you can drink, something you can think about, people that you can call out on the trail, kind of have those like low strategy mitigators. As well as have like visualize yourself in the high moments, thinking like, oh, everything's great. Like I just had a caffeine gel. Like I'm not hungry. Like we're into the race. We're doing this. But then visualize yourself kind of like tempering the flame a little bit, right? Because endurance sports are all about patience and spreading the load nice and evenly. So that way we don't have these huge spikes and crashes in energy and morality. So mentally dialing in your plan like that is going to be fantastic. Some tools that can help you are Chris Pugacco. Sorry if I pronounced your last name
I
wrong. I
think
don't think
every
I
time you
really.
say it different. We're gonna have to have the guy on so you can say his name.
Honestly, his YouTube videos are
So
absolutely fantastic. He does a lot of them in the area. He's got a couple on Kettle Moraine now, I believe. So you can go and at least if you've never been on the course, you can see what the course looks like. So that way, when you're visualizing, it's a little bit more accurate. Um, but also 6 weeks away from a race, like you mentioned before, Loretta, like we still have some time to throw in a couple longer runs in, start dialing in that gearing selection. And 6 weeks away from a race, if you haven't been doing any like heat training or heat strategies, you're getting into the sauna, you can definitely start some of that now. Of course, like with anything new that you start, like start a little bit lighter, maybe 10 minutes in the sauna to start, maybe only building up to maybe two sessions or so a week whenever you go into the gym of between 10 to 15, maybe 20 minutes. And that'll give you enough exposure to at least give you a leg up on what the heat is going to entail. I probably like things that I wouldn't start in the last 6 weeks of a race. And like, let me know if you think this is false, but I wouldn't start any heavy strength training. I wouldn't really, if you haven't been strength training, like don't do anything that's going to be heavier than body weight for now. you know, and build that in gradually. If you haven't done a squat in a long time, but you've been running 100-mile weeks, like that's awesome. You do 30 body weight squats, and I promise you're gonna feel it by your gluteal fold just because your body hasn't been in that range of motion for a while. So yeah, if somebody was like, I haven't been doing strength, but I really want to, and I'm running Kettle 100, what should I do? I'd be like, do like 20 air squats, do some push-ups, maybe some tricep dips, maybe some planks, things like
Maybe some
that.
some single leg stuff could be good right now.
Exactly. Some balance stuff.
Just body single weight work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Step
I
up.
like
Yeah.
I wouldn't say go and get under a barbell. Like
Yeah.
it's too soon to really reap the better rewards of strength training for sure. That should have been done a little bit like,
Right.
earlier in the season.
I mean, it's
Um,
going to take at least probably 6 weeks to really notice a difference in the strength once you start strength training. So yeah, so we're
yeah.
pretty tight to that. So we're considering taper is coming, and we're going to kind of back off of that, strength piece anyway. So yeah,
Well,
not really a great time, but afterwards and after your recovery, if you have some time before a race, then you can, start into that cycle.
for sure. Maybe that's when you like build it in your transition season, after if this is your A race after that race for sure.
Yep.
Um, because like, if we think about like most people are going to take like a 2 to 3 week like gradual ramp down into a 100-miler, that really gives you like 3 weeks, 4 weeks of like solid training, with which like 4 to 6 weeks away from, or excuse me, 6 to 3 weeks away from a race, like you should be partitioning more energy towards running anyways, because that's going to be the most specific
Right.
thing. So yeah, just don't do the heavy stuff. Wait till later. Can you think about anything else you wouldn't do 6 weeks before a race?
I
Don't
wouldn't.
cross train a ton. Don't like ramp down your mileage in running and think, oh, I'm just going to be biking a shit ton now, because it's
Right,
not.
right.
You're just
Yeah,
going
I
to put
wouldn't be
different
adding in
stress
a
on
bunch
your
of stuff
body.
right now. Like I would be kind of sticking to the plan that you have. It's, if you haven't been doing it, it's too late to put it in at this point. Just sticking
Mhm.
to your running and your nutrition. I probably wouldn't be changing your nutrition up a whole lot either. Just kind of tweaking little tweaks is good, but
Mhm.
or changing, what you've been doing because you want to go in comfortable and what you've been doing. You've already put in all of this work, hopefully up until now that you're almost you can smell the barn, right? It's coming.
For sure. I think too, like 6 weeks away from a race, let's take somebody who's in my position. Um, you got really overly zealous about doing your absolute best in this race, and it left you a little injured. And now, like, oh shoot, like there's time enough to like get some training in. Maybe you're feeling better now, and you're starting to get back into it. But how should you like? How would you take an athlete who's like, man, I had some really good runs. How would you coach me, Loretta? Like, what would you tell me right now leading into Kettle? And then maybe I could tell you what I'm planning on for myself, and we could talk about it.
Okay. Well, maybe you should find a different coach. No, just kidding.
Yeah,
So,
I'm
so yeah.
fired.
So first of all, I think that you already have a bunch of base built up. So I don't think you have to worry too much about that, right? And you already have finished a 100-mile race. So that is those two big things I think going into this. So as far as training from here to there, I would probably focus on getting out on the trails, just going out and moving your legs, not really trying to overexert yourself because we don't want to mess with that niggle, right? So not changing any of that. And then I would probably for mental more than anything, more than the physical piece, getting in a couple good long runs just to build your confidence for that. So you're feeling good about that. I feel like it's not going to be a huge deal for you because you're going to bounce right back because you do have so much base, going into this race. So I wouldn't be terribly worried about that. I would probably still throw in some easy stride work, nothing super fast, but just to kind of get your legs moving as you're, going in. And of course, if you can get on some rolling hills would be good because you are going to be, doing some of that hill work. You've been doing all kinds of cardio with your cycling with no impact. So really just getting that impact is going to kind of just all translate into being ready, I think.
I That's beautiful, because that's exactly what I've been I've been thinking myself, like, like, so building back like up from injury, the way that I see it is like I'm not like pressured to like have my longest long run be this week or next week and then taper back down into the race because my legs have already been like tapered. I already put in like a really decent block for Potawatomi. I raced really well. And
Yeah.
now like as I thought I would be able to recover in a week or two and then kind of like put my mileage back up and then kind of drop down into Kettle. But of course you alter expectations.
Right.
I had to take a couple like lower weeks of running. Like you said, I've been doing a lot of cross training, which is something that like for the listeners, if you haven't biked or if you like haven't been indoor biking, you can't just get injured like running and then do a ton of cross training because I want to say for the past like, well, we got it in December and I've been an avid cyclist for probably just as long as I've been ultra running now. So my body's kind of like familiar with the mechanics. I've been incorporating the bike at least like 1 to 3 times, if not like a little bit more during the weeks. So when I was like, okay, I'm just going to transition to replacing all of my running hours with biking hours because I build that time into my schedule. It's possible for my body and it's not going to overdo it because my body's already been familiar with it. I just go from like, like a moderate amount of biking to a little bit higher amount of biking. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Your body's
whereas
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
yeah, maybe like cross training for somebody else means going out for walks. Maybe it means doing a little bit more of strength or rehab work, which I've also been doing on my calf too. So yeah, now that I'm like slowly starting to transition, like building up my running and then dropping like back down my biking, trying to be really cautious and aware of my body and how it feels. Again, still holding on to the idea of Kettle, but holding it loosely in case I need to let it go for better long-term success. I'm only 29. I plan on at least racing until I'm 89. So
I'm
it's a
going to
lot. It's
100, so I might
yeah,
be.
it's about yeah, why not? So that's another 60 years of running that I want to be able to do. But yeah, like you said, I'm going to slowly start. I'm not going to do any more hero workouts. I'm not going to do any more hero days. I'm going to let the long runs just kind of like slowly build up. And I'm going to think about building into Kettle instead of like ramping down and tapering into Kettle.
Right. Yeah.
Because I want to make sure that my legs feel fluid, they feel loose. I've had some elevation in my training. I've had a little bit of speed work, but nothing like threshold intervals, nothing super hard, no tough back-to-back days. So a lot of my stuff is going to be easier, like zone 2 out of a zone 5 model, or that zone 1 out of a 3 zone model. Super easy heart rate, talking pace, things like that. So for other people that may find themselves injured, currently in an injury, you got to just play it smart like that, right? Like do cross training if you can, if your body has been used to it, do the rehab exercises, hold on to that faith. When you gradually start to build back into the running, don't just try the same amount of volume that you've been doing before. Typically my runs would be about like 10 miles in an average run. When I was starting to like build back and like find that flow again, my first run was just down the street and back to go get some Cubs clothes for a Cubs game that my girlfriend and I went to. That felt pretty good. That was like a mile. And then I did another one that was about like 3 miles and then 6 miles and 7 miles. And I think like the longest I've ran in like 4 or 5 weeks has been like 8 miles.
Mhm.
So you really do got to take it gradually and think that like, hey, the performance is going to be on the race. Then the performance isn't going to be in the training, So,
I love a few things that you said. One, like cross training is great, but like you said, you can't just translate it into your running. Let's say you're doing 8 hours a week of running. You can't all of a sudden do 8 hours a week of cycling if you've not been cycling. Like in your instance, you have, or let's say the elliptical. You can't just translate that completely over. And then you also need to think about like, okay, I've been injured for a few weeks, I'm not running, and now I'm just going to go right back to my 60-mile weeks or whatever you're doing. You know what I mean? So you need to kind of build that up. Sure, you went out on your first run and you felt amazing and you thought you could run for 10 miles, but should you have, right? Should you have just, let your body sort of adjust and slowly build? So I think being really careful with that is super smart coming out of injury. And it's hard to pull the reins back, especially when you know that you have a race coming and you're trying to build and you want to be where you want to be. But if you're smart, you're going to make it to the finish line more likely if you actually go in on less miles than on trying to just jump right back to where you were.
For sure. Yeah. And it depends on your background too, right?
For
Like if you're
sure.
fairly
Absolutely.
seasoned, you have a little bit more confidence. I think the trick is, or the tricky part is when you have somebody who is new to ultra marathons, maybe hasn't completed their first 100-mile race and they're starting to get anxious or starting to get like oh shit, like all of my goals are like out of the window now. And
Right.
you got to think like you have the best chances of success in a race if you come in undertrained, but like healthy and
Yes.
eager to be there, as opposed to being a little bit overtrained or a little bit injured or trying to push it a little bit too hard from the start. Um, so yeah, I just I think that was a good topic and a good personal like experience, to just kind of like share there, because there's multiple ways to get to the end destination, right? Like
Sure.
nothing ever goes to plan. I tell my athletes this all the time. Like nothing ever go like the idea of how I thought like this part of the year would go has like definitely like drastically altered. So you got to be willing to roll with the punches. In the best part or the best skill for ultra running is going to be adaptability.
Yes, absolutely. Whether it's on race day or whether it's leading up to race day, right? Or in your life, you have to be adaptable. Yep.
That's right.
Yep.
Well, I think we covered it pretty well. I think that's another good, a good episode on all things kettle. And again, if you want to hear some like a different, like a perspective from a year ago, go check it out in the
Right.
podcast archives. But other than that, it was a pleasure talking with you, Loretta. So thanks for all your wisdom and going through the course with me. I love talking kettle. Hopefully, everybody loves listening about kettle. So I thought that was a good show.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. It was good to see you.
Yeah,
We'll see you again next week.
yeah, you bet. Take care.
Right. Bye.